Hello and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be taking a look at the early vote totals from the top 5 battleground states 1 week out from the midterm election. So we'll be looking at the election early vote totals through Target Smart, which again is really the best lens we have to kind of analyze which side really has the momentum, because we've seen the polling, Republicans are up in the polls, but which side really has the momentum when it actually comes to votes cast. And of course, Target Smart is not 100% reliable. They have to model some of the party affiliations. Obviously, we have no real way of knowing who's actually voting until election day, but it's really the best window that we have at this point in time. So we'll be taking a look at these 5 states in particular because they all have competitive governor and Senate elections, although I'd argue Wisconsin's Senate is a bit out of the question, but nonetheless, these 5 states are probably the most important going into this midterm cycle, which is why we're going to be zeroing in on it in today's video. So obviously, before we get started, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing down below, liking this video if you enjoy. I'm uploading twice a day from now until November 8th. This is my second upload of the day. If you have any suggestions for any videos you want me to make on various key races, comment them down below. And also link down below to the election night live stream, 7 p.m. Eastern on election day. Anyway, with that out of the way, let's get straight into the video. So first, when we take a look at the early vote, let's take a look at the national profile, because currently we're at a point in time where Democrats are actually doing slightly better than they did back in 2020. Of course, the 2022 totals have the Democrats with 50.8% of the projected early vote, Republicans at 39.2%, unaffiliated at exactly 10%. In 2020, that number at this point in time, 1 week out, was 50.2% for the Democrats, 39.4%. So really very much in the margin of error. Again, this is modeled party, so this is not 100% accurate. This just takes Target Smart's model of how these voters would, hypothetically vote based on a number of characteristics in their voting history and kind of puts it into this model. Of course, if I were to put it by registered party, we'd get a result like this, because a lot of states don't actually make voters register with a specific party in order to vote. They just remain unaffiliated. And Texas does that, which is a very big chunk of this. A bunch of other states do it as well. So that's why in today's video, we're going to be focusing on the modeled party, which is really our best window that we have. And we'll start off with the state of Nevada. Now, we can filter this through states. We can also look at key counties, and we'll take a look at Clark and Washoe in just a second. But taking a look at Nevada's statewide totals for 2022, the Democrats are doing better than the Republicans as compared to 2020. Of course, the 2022 numbers have Democrats with 50.6% of the early vote, Republicans at 43%. In 2020, Democrats were at 48.1 to 43.6. Now, the key to all of this is the million-dollar question of whether or not Democrats are going to vote early at the same rates they did in 2020. And there's some indicators that say that it'll be around that number, and there's some indicators that tell us that that's not going to be the case. Because certainly if that is the case and we get a similar sort of turnout to 2020, Republicans could be in a bit of trouble in the state of Nevada with these early vote numbers. Again, modeled party, 50.6% of the early vote going to Democrats. In 2020, that number was just 48.1%. And of course, we pull up the 2020 results for the state of Nevada. Joe Biden won Nevada by 2.4%. So obviously, Republicans are banking on really large election day turnout to offset the deficit they're going to have in the early vote. This was always kind of the case with Republicans. Republicans have always voted more on election day than utilized early and absentee voting. Democrats always were more likely to utilize that. And, as a result for Republicans, discouraging the use of early and mail-in votes in 2020, that's why we saw the red mirage effect, where the early day vote was heavily favoring the Republicans. You had Republicans winning these Rust Belt states by 20 points in some cases. And then as the absentee and early votes started to come in, that narrowed. Those votes weren't new votes. They were cast, in fact, before Election Day, but they tended to skew heavily Democratic, mainly because a lot of Democratic voters feared COVID a lot more than Republican voters. So will we see something similar like that this time around, since Democrats really have been utilizing vote by mail? Perhaps, although I tend to lean towards the fact that more Democrats will vote on Election Day than we saw last time. Really, Republicans' saving grace would be really high Election Day turnout to sort of offset what we're seeing currently in Nevada. Now, of course, the amount of votes cast total is about half of what we saw in 2020. So that's a good sign for Republicans, especially if they have energized turnout. We see sort of a 2018 style of turnout. Of course, so far we're at 31% of the 2018 totals with just a week to go. So will we pass 2018 totals in the early vote? Maybe. I lean towards no. I don't think there's enough time. But in terms of total vote cast, I certainly think we're going to see higher turnout than 2018. And, if we break this down by county, for instance, we can go to Clark County real quickly, which is about, 60, 70% of the population in Nevada. What's interesting here is that Republicans are actually doing better in Clark County than in 2020. In 2020, the Democrats had 53.2% of the modeled early vote. Republicans had 38. Now we're at 52.8. Republicans at 40.7. So this is a bit of a saving grace for Republicans. Clark County trending more Republican does make sense. We've seen that since really 2008. Every single presidential cycle is getting closer and closer to the point where, despite the national environment favoring Democrats by 4 points in 2020, we saw Clark County only go to Joe Biden by 9, which, for reference, is pretty close, especially when Clark County went to Barack Obama by 15, 16 percentage points back in 2008. So we've seen a significant narrowing up there. We'd also take a look at Washoe, which is basically a 25%, 20% of Nevada's population. In this case, we see Democrats doing about the same as they were, very similar margins. So I guess in terms of the red counties, you're seeing a bit more Democratic enthusiasm in the rest of the state. But I think you'll probably see that offset by Election Day votes. But again, we still got a week to go. These numbers could certainly change, but Republicans started out decently strong in the early vote, and it seems that over time they're starting to sink lower and lower as Democrats are starting to increase their margins in the early vote. And we've seen this not just in Nevada, but in other states. So we'll see if this trend does continue. Moving on over to Arizona. Arizona has perhaps one of the most important Senate races, along with Pennsylvania, of course. Mark Kelly, the incumbent Democratic senator there, is hoping to hang on. He only won by 2.4% in 2020. Now we're looking at a much redder environment. The real question is, can he hang on despite that? So the early vote in Arizona is looking better for the GOP. Of course, back in 2020, the Republicans had a 1.5 advantage over the Democrats in this Target Smart early vote. Now they have a 2.8% advantage, so it is looking better for them in Arizona. Of course, again, this is modeled party, so again, there is somewhat of a margin of error in this as well. This isn't exactly 100% accurate, but based on Target Smart's models from 2020 to 2022, Republicans are doing slightly better in the state of Arizona. And of course, if we take a look at Maricopa County, which is about 62% of Arizona's total population, we see a similar story. Republicans are doing better than where they were back in 2020. Of course, in 2020, they had about a 4-point lead in the early absentee vote report. Now they have about a 6-point lead. So very interesting. Republicans doing better in Arizona so far, a little bit worse in Nevada. It is a bit concerning, I think, for the GOP, the fact that polls in Nevada tend to overestimate Republican support. And if the numbers on the ground are any indicator, there could be a little bit of trouble for the GOP in Nevada. Of course, we still have a week of early voting. We'll revisit this, by the way, on Election Day. The only video I'll be uploading on Election Day, besides the live stream, will, of course, be the last sort of early vote report, which will be kind of like our final look into what we can expect before Election Day. Moving on over to the state of Wisconsin. Wisconsin has a very competitive governor's race, less so in the Senate. Ron Johnson has been doing really well, even in some left-leaning polls like Fox News. He's been leading, so that's a really good sign for him. Looking at the 2020 to 2022 numbers, we have a really interesting phenomenon sort of taking place here. Back in 2020, Republicans led the early vote by a pretty sizable margin, at least according to this model, 43.9 to 35. Now the Republicans are actually at a deficit, 38.5, 32.4, with independents making up nearly 30% of the modeled support. That seems a bit wacky to me. I don't know. That does seem a bit odd. Of course, we're not going to compare this to 2018 because 2018 really doesn't have any relevance to 2020 or 2022 vote totals, because the current voting system that we have is really because of COVID, and that only really started in 2020. So any 2018 models, I'm just completely disregarding because there's really not much to go off of. Of course, in 2020, I used those models because it's all we had to go off of then, but really it's not that much of a good indicator. So Wisconsin is pretty interesting, to say the least. I don't really know what to make of these numbers, quite frankly, especially because the unaffiliated has really shot up in terms of turnout. If unaffiliated really are breaking for Republicans, then that's a group that might favor them, but Democrats are still up in the early vote. So that is quite interesting. Next state we're going to look at is the state of Pennsylvania. I'm going to dive into this one a little bit deeper than Wisconsin, because Wisconsin, by most people's accounts, is going Republican both in the Senate and in the governorship. So Pennsylvania is one of those states that really is a real toss-up. You know, the consensus on PA is really that the governorship is going to be won by the Democrats, and then the Senate race is really the toss-up there. So this is really interesting. So Looking at the Target Smart model for Pennsylvania's early vote, Democrats are doing much better than they were back in 2020, and that's a good sign for Democrats. If we take a look at the totals back in 2020, there's 1.1 million votes cast by model Democrats. Of course, now you have 616,000. This, of course, was a week before, so still time for the Republicans to close this gap, but Republicans had 28.1% of the modeled early vote at this point in time. Now they have 23.8%. So a 5-point drop for the GOP here and a decently sized increase for the Democrats. So this is a silver lining for Democrats. Now, only 17% of the total votes cast in 2018 were cast currently. So that is a bit lower than some of these other states. I think early voting in PA, I'm not sure if they have early in-person voting. It might just be early by mail. So it's a bit of a different system. It might be a smaller percentage of the total electorate at the end of the day. But the fact that Republicans are underperforming in this regard really isn't good for them. And though the polls have candidates like Oz gaining ground on John Fetterman, these numbers do paint a slightly different story. Could be an instance of polls overestimating Republicans. But again, given the other polls we're seeing, I am a bit skeptical. Also, you have the unaffiliated dropping quite a bit. Now, if we go by registered party, it's not as dramatic for the GOP as the modeled party. So Democrats were at 71.8% currently in terms of registered ballots, I guess, requested and returned. Republicans at 21% in 2020. Now they're at 20%. And of course, in 2020, Democrats were at 69%. So Democrats still doing better, but it's not as dramatic as the modeled party. So I guess take of this what you will, but it looks like Democrats, either way you look at it, are doing better in the early vote so far. And finally, let's get to the state of Georgia. Now, Georgia, again, has not as competitive of a governor's race. Brian Kemp looks like a very clear favorite there. But in terms of the Senate race, it really is a major toss-up because either party could win this. And there are no registered parties in Georgia, so we got to go by modeled parties. So in 2020, Republicans led the early absentee vote 48-43. Now, currently, we have Democrats leading that vote 49-41. So Democrats started out with a giant lead in Georgia. Their lead has started to sort of taper off a bit, sort of to plateau at this point. But, not really good news for the GOP, especially since, this is supposed to be a really strong year for them. They should be doing better in the early vote, although it could be argued that less Republicans trust early and mail-in voting now than they did in 2020. But, I've heard conflicting reports on that. So, in terms of Georgia, this is really interesting. One thing that I think I really want to look at is these statistics by race, because Georgia is a very racially polarized state. White voters in Georgia tend to vote for the Republican Party 70-30. Black voters tend to vote for the Democratic Party about 92-8, somewhere around there. So it's one of those states where black and white turnout, really does have an impact on the election results since the electorate is so polarized. I mean, even in 2020, the white vote only moved to the left by a couple of points. So any movement in any of these groups, any movement toward black voters voting to the GOP, vice versa, is going to have a pretty big reaction, especially since Georgia was the closest state in the 2020 election, decided by less than 12,000 votes and 0.2 percentage points. So really, really a nail biter in Georgia. And the Senate race in particular, I think we're likely to see that again. Now, looking at the early vote by race, African-American early vote is up 32.5 to white voters 62.2. I mean, that's a negligible increase. That's about the same. So you're looking at the white turnout being about the same as it was in 2020. And of course, black turnout is up in the early vote. And we've got 41.6% of total votes cast in 2018. So it looks like Georgia's really going to be a very high turnout state, especially compared to these other ones, because this is the highest we've seen so far. The week to go, the GOP really does have some work to do in a lot of these states, because again, if we take a look at party, Democrats are up in the early vote absentee report, whereas Republicans were up back in 2020. I remember I said even in 2020 when we saw these results come in, the Republicans were leading, but not by as much. I said it would probably lead to a decently close race in Georgia, and ultimately I predicted Georgia would narrowly go to Donald Trump. It narrowly went to Joe Biden. It was the only state I got wrong in 2020. So looking at these results now, Democrats certainly are doing pretty well in the early vote overall. Again, Target Smart is not the end-all be-all. There's other sites where you can analyze this information. But I figured I'd look at it just because I've looked at Target Smart back in 2020, so I figured I'd repeat tradition and do it a week out from the election like I did last time. And then, of course, we'll look at these results on Election Day. So anyway, guys, that's it for today's video. Please leave a thumbs up if you enjoyed, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell notification so you miss any more videos I put out. Link down to the Election Night live stream down below, 7 p.m. Eastern on Election Day. We'll be streaming all throughout the night. Hopefully we get some interesting race calls so we can kind of have a determination of where the midterms are headed on Election Night. So we'll see how quick a lot of these states count their votes, what the margins actually are. So make sure to join us down below. And as always, again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.